When World War II is discussed, the description of it usually goes something like this. Evil Hitler was planning on world domination. At first, the Allies tried to appease him by giving him the land he wanted, but saying no more after this. Stupid Neville Chamberlain was then embarrassed as Hitler simply did what he wanted anyway and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Then, Hitler wanted to take over Poland, but the heroic Allies stood up and said no, opposing Hitler in an attempt to save the world from him taking it all over. If they didn't stop him now, then who would? At first, the Allies were beaten back, trying to save poor innocent Norway from Hitler's invasion, and then in the Low Countries, and then France, sending them packing across the English Channel. They were beaten, but not defeated. Eventually, with the help of their staunch allies, the United States, who wanted to help save the world and fight for democracy, Europe was once again liberated and Nazism destroyed in a heroic struggle. It is known as the Good War, a one fought purely for wholesome, world-saving reasons. But is this true? Is this actually what happened? As you can probably guess by the title and the nature of my channel, no, it isn't. Let's discuss why the so-called Good War wasn't so good after all. The idea that Britain declared war on Germany purely for altruistic reasons is completely ridiculous, even without looking beneath the surface. Nations do not fight wars for such causes. If we did, we would all invade Africa immediately to prevent the brutal suffering, ethnic cleansing, and civil wars that occur there on a daily basis. So what was actually going on? It is true that Chamberlain, a man generally led by moral compulsion, was trying to make a stand against Hitler for moral reasons, but he never wanted war himself. He just hoped endless bluffs would work. When it came to Hitler actually invading Poland, then he very quickly tried to worm his way out, fulfilling the guarantee, which had deliberately been worded so that Britain had to defend Polish independence and not her borders. This failed, however, as almost immediately he was threatened with being overthrown by the more war-hungry members of Parliament, which leads us to the real reason Britain joined the war, as ultimately it was these men who firstly pushed Chamberlain to do so and then actually did the job themselves after 1940 when they ousted him. A small handful of men in Britain completely corrupted both public opinion and the government itself to push for war for their own aims, quite contrary to men like Chamberlain who were on a moral crusade, much like we British love to go on, as with the abolition of slavery, putting ourselves horribly in debt just to enforce it. These men's motives ranged between personal ethnic gripes with Germany due to Hitler's new policies to just straight up being paid to agitate for war with Germany. Regardless, they all shared a common goal: war, the destruction of Germany, and regime change. The most famous of these is obviously Winston Churchill. Churchill found himself deeply in debt in the interwar years, even having to list his family estate on the housing market to avoid bankruptcy. Luckily for Churchill, however, a shadowy group called the Focus turned up, consisting of a handful of men wanting war against Germany who were willing to pump millions of dollars into this cause. Chief among them, men such as Sir Henry Strakosch, based in South Africa, Alfred Bergman, based in the US, and Robert Wally Cohen, based in the UK, among others. Strakosch and the Focus completely lifted Churchill out of debt and made him a very rich man. The catch was, Churchill had to be utterly belligerent and make sure Britain went to war, much like he had done in the First World War. He fulfilled his obligations to the letter, and then some. One who behaved much in the same vein as Churchill was his right-hand man, Anthony Eden, who sabotaged Britain's somewhat cordial relationship with Mussolini shortly before the war. Another on payroll was Duff Cooper, who would become Minister of Information as soon as his fellow conspirator Churchill came to office. Duff had staunchly opposed Chamberlain's appeasement, and after Munich he simply resigned his position. His masters had a new job for him, however. Over the next year, he set off on a propaganda speaking tour of the United States, speaking of the need for the democracies to stand firm against dictatorship and trying to turn the isolationist-minded Americans into war-hungry interventionists. There was also Leslie Hall Belisha, Cooper's replacement as the Secretary of State for War. As soon as he took up the position, he was absolutely belligerent at getting the war he so desperately wanted.
No peace proposals which rely for their sanction on a broken word can be considered. Nothing but the establishment of a new order from which the menace of Nazi oppression is removed can justify us in laying down our arms.
Even his colleagues, both before and increasingly so as the war progressed, called him a vile warmonger, and serious tensions began to bubble up, wondering what Hall Belisha's true motives actually were. He went on to fall out with almost everyone. Oswald Mosley publicly slammed him as a, quote, Jewish warmonger, and many in the government were whispering their agreement. Tensions went on to reach breaking point between Lord Gort, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force in France. Horbalicia just wanted the Brits to get in there, no matter the cost to British lives. Chamberlain ended up dismissing him in 1940, and Henry Pournal, the chief of staff for the BEF, said that, quote, the ultimate fact is that they could never get on. You couldn't expect two such utterly different people to do so. A great gentleman and an obscure, shallow-brained charlatan, political Jew boy, end quote. Horbalicia never really recovered in his political career. Wherever he went, others felt as if his religion and racial hatred was driving his policy, as opposed to the actual interests of the British people. Even King George VI was all in favour of expelling this man from politics, both for his warmongering and for opposing him in the abdication crisis. Ultimately, Horbalicia was indeed expelled to the political wilderness, and he died in 1957. So essentially, there was two sides to Britain intervening against Germany. On the one hand, you had the men like Chamberlain, who by all accounts just wanted to do the right thing, and they were compelled by their morals to do something. But ultimately, this policy is both emotional and erratic. On the other, you have the extremely calculated warmongers, many taking orders from above, and others, as discussed, doing so for their own gain. There were many more than those mentioned, but these were the main offenders. Britain entering the war for good intentions, at best, can be put down as only half true, at the most, but this is only theory. Entering the war and the outcome of the war are two very different things. Germany's crimes during the war are put on a pedestal and portrayed as uniquely evil, whilst the Allies are completely minimised and left out of the narrative. Not once was Dresden mentioned in my history classes at high school. The reality is that wars are not fought between good and evil, but between ideas. The Germans, had they won, would portray the British as the exact same, the evil intervening against their good intentions for their own people. When Germany had the upper hand and had occupied almost all of Western Europe, Hitler enforced strict laws demanding that the civilian populations of nations like France, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and even the Channel Islands owned by the UK to be treated immaculately. Any Germans found to be acting tyrannically to the locals were executed on the spot. In practice, this worked pretty well until the last couple of years of the war, when increased resistance led to increased repression and things went downhill. The same cannot be said, however, for the occupation of Germany by the so-called good guys of this war. German soldiers were thrown into camps at the war's end and given barely any, if any, food or water. Thousands of Germans who had willingly laid down their arms died of thirst just meters away from the River Rhine behind huge fenced open-air enclosures known as the Rhineland Meadows camps. The civilian population wasn't treated much better. An order was issued forbidding Allied troops to mingle with the locals so that a food blockade could be established as a kind of punishment to the German people. There was ample food, and the soldiers had more than they could eat, but they were forbidden to give any to the civilians. Hundreds of thousands starved to death. Women turned to prostitution to get by, essentially becoming sex slaves in Allied barracks so that they could feed their children. Meanwhile, many men simply just killed themselves, unable to live amidst the rubble that remained of their homeland, which the Allies made no attempt to rebuild until it was politically necessary when they fell out with the Soviet Union. In fact, more German civilians died in the few years after the war's conclusion than they did during the entire war, which is saying a lot given that Dresden and Hamburg occurred during the war. All that is to say, does this seem like a war of good against bad? Perhaps it's more complicated than that. Was it really a good war after all? The so-called good cause that we joined the war for was to preserve Polish independence. If you take one look at a post-1945 map, however, it becomes immediately clear that fighting World War II not only didn't save Poland or even enforce the status quo, but it actually made life worse for most Europeans. Stalin was quite literally handed over Eastern Europe by Churchill. The Polish government in exile was essentially told to take a hike, and this staunch ally was just given away to Stalin, the man who had already killed hundreds of thousands of Poles even before the war's conclusion. As the war went on, obviously it became about more than just Poland. Internationalism versus nationalism, capitalism versus national socialism, liberal values versus conservative ones, just to name a few. But ultimately, the fact of the matter remains that we fought a war to protect Polish independence, and this is the narrative given to us, that this was a good cause. What isn't discussed is that we failed in this mission, and in fact, just gave not only Poland, but all of Eastern Europe away to the Soviets. whom almost all Eastern Europeans feared far more than Hitler's Germany, who they happily jumped into bed with at the first opportunity in 1940, when they were made to choose a side. Our entire worldview is now shaped by the battle between good and evil. You can do absolutely anything against the so-called bad guys, and that's a-okay. For example, in the US, if you were to call someone the N-word, and then they simply murder you in return, many would say this is your just desserts, because racists are the bad guys. The same is true on a broader level. On posts of white children being murdered on Twitter, you will find hundreds of comments celebrating because the current narrative is that white people are evil for our supposed former sins of slavery. Every movie is seen as good versus bad, as if this is how the world actually is. The truth is that the world is a very complex place, and wars are especially so. Perhaps it's time to start looking at the reality of World War II, rather than the Marvel movie version we currently have for it. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, and the channel in general, then please do consider subscribing to my Patreon in the link in the description. It helps more than you can imagine, and without my patrons, these videos would not be possible. Even the $2 tier goes a long way. Thank you to Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Lanza, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, and Wunderwaffer.